to Dr. Law.
Beautiful. Thank you, thank you. Okay, team, so last one of the day, and I want to get you out of here at 2:30, so we're going to move through this, and I'll get you all the information we need. I'll keep you on time. As we start here, we're transitioning, obviously, to a later part of the application cycle. This is the interview portion. So interviews are going to happen during a very wide window of time, anywhere from about 2 months after submission of your primary application, all the way up until March and even April of the following year. So potentially we're talking about 6, 7, 8-month window of time. Anywhere in there, interview invites can be coming, and anywhere in there you might be scheduling interviews over that entire period of time. So it's important to be prepared, and it's important to know what to expect because you never know what's coming. Has anyone, first of all, how many are familiar with what the MMI is as compared to traditional interviews? Very good, handful here. Okay, so we're going to cover the basics for sure. Has anyone actually done an actual MMI interview? Okay, good. So hopefully some of what I cover won't be a total shock and surprise, but even if it is, there's still time and there may be interviews coming in your future. My interview experience specifically with MMIs comes from my time at UC San Diego. I was an MMI interviewer there and helped kind of design their framework for their MMI interview approaches that they do down there. So I've done MMIs, I've designed questions, I've graded and scored, hundreds if not thousands of applicants like yourself going through the process. So MMIs are something I'm super familiar with and love getting to help applicants with in the process. So today we're going to cover what is the MMI. We'll go over MMI strategies, and then I'm going to ask for your help to start kind of putting some of these things into practice. And I think the general approach that we're going to bring that you'll start to understand is with an MMI type setting, there's so many different types of questions that they can throw at you and all these different unique circumstances, etc. And I think what I watch a lot of applicants do is try to prepare for any possible niche thing that might be thrown their way during these interviews. So instead of that approach, which can kind of feel almost limitless, what we're going to do is break them down into buckets and kind of cover the most common types of questions you're going to be asked, develop a specific framework that you can bring to any of those questions so that when you're faced with that unique scenario, which odds are you probably haven't prepared for, you'll be able to fall back upon this foundation and apply this framework to just about any question that you're faced with in this process. So just quick background on the MMI itself. I think most are familiar with traditional interviews. Traditional interviews, maybe one-on-one, you versus with one of the other faculty or a couple other faculty. You go back and forth, you have a conversation, lasts about 30 minutes. That's the traditional interview that I think everyone's pretty familiar with. Now, MMIs were designed because naturally, those traditional interviews can be quite subjective. One applicant's experience is going to be completely different from the next applicant's experience. You walk into that room, you have a conversation with one of the faculty members, what you talk about for 30 minutes compared to what the next applicant comes in and talks about for 30 minutes is going to be completely different, which creates a level of subjectivity in the evaluations and interviews that we're trying to eliminate with the MMI process. The idea behind MMIs is that every applicant has the same experience. Every applicant is asked the same questions. Every applicant gets the same response from the interviewer over the course of the interview. So when you work through the cycles, your experience is the same as the applicant that comes right after you, and that allows you to compare applicants more objectively versus the subjective traditional interview. So more and more schools in today's world are implementing MMIs because it allows for a somewhat objective metric to be applied to what is naturally a subjective thing, and that's interviewing, okay? So just to highlight the importance of preparing for these and kind of having some strategies under your belt. Now, just general, big picture interview preparation things. I don't think any of this is too crazy. This is not the time to put on your neon yellow shirt and your fancy new tie, right? We're going to dress pretty conservative, very traditional. When you stand out in an interview, it's because of your preparation and your answers. It is not because of your appearance or what you're wearing. That's the traditional rule of thumb that we should all bring to the interviews. Because most of the time, if we're standing out for other reasons, I don't see that help people very often, most of the time. We want to know where we're going, obviously. Or the virtual interviews, you want to make sure your background is nice and clean, nothing abnormal, nothing that's going to catch the interviewer's eye. And sometimes during the interview day, whether traditional or MMI, having a notebook with you to kind of jot down some of the different things that come up, some of the different people that you talk to, whether it's somebody's name or this unique thing that happened while you were there. When it comes time later down the road and you're interacting with the university, either with a thank you note or an update letter later in the cycle, being able to include some of those tangible details that you remember from your experience can make a big difference. So having a notebook to jot some ideas, I think, can be really beneficial. So big picture preparation for the MMI. It's important to review your application. You should know what you've already given to any school, and that's true pretty much across the board. They're going to have reviewed your application for the most part, but you also need to know what you said, what you haven't said. If you have significant updates that maybe aren't on your primary application, you need to know that that's not on your primary application because you want to bring it up during the interviews. You also want to go in there with some preparation and knowledge of the school that you're at. Each school is going to have unique aspects of their curriculum, what they're trying to accomplish, core parts of their mission that are unique to them and very specific to them, and they're going to take great pride in that information. If you walk in there without any knowledge of those points, they're not going to love that, right? Everyone is super proud of what they do at each of these schools, and they want to feel that passion with you. So going in there with that preparation is going to be really important. And then, of course, there's nothing that's going to help you more than practice, particularly with MMIs. It's very unnatural to be asked a question and then have someone sit there and stare at you for 4 straight minutes while you give an answer without much feedback, right? But because of this kind of objective system, the interviewer is instructed to give you very little feedback because they can't give you feedback and not the next person. So you're going to face someone who's pretty stone cold, not giving you a lot of smiles or positive feedback, and that's normal and that's okay. But that can be a little off-putting, and that's why the practice and the preparation going into that setting is really, really important, because I know a lot of people are caught off guard when there's no follow-up, there's no thank you for your answer, there's a head nod and an okay, and it's on to the next question. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, these are the most common buckets of questions that you will face in an MMI setting. Ethical dilemmas, difficult patients, some sort of role play scenario, and then I have to remind you at any point in time, you can always be faced with traditional interview questions. There's a myth that in the MMI setting, they do not ask traditional interview questions. That is completely false. So your why do you want to be a doctor question, your classic tell me about a weakness question, your classic tell me about your research question, all of things have the potential to come up in any MMI setting. So really you have to prepare for anything, okay? So what I want to do is we're going to go through one by one through each of these specific MMI type questions and review what they're looking for, and then give you a framework for how to build a constructive answer for any of these types of scenarios that you're faced with. So first and foremost is going to be the ethical dilemma. And ultimately, what these are going to get at is you're going to be faced with a difficult decision. And in the ethical dilemma worlds, the reason that the decision will feel so difficult to you is because they're going to take 2 of the core pillars of medical ethics, right? And I have the 4 principles of medical ethics right there. They're going to take 2 of them, and they're going to build a scenario in which you have to pick between one or the other. So it's going to feel uncomfortable, it's going to feel awkward, because you're going to want to be able to do both things, but they're going to force you to choose, okay? So type of example here, someone's on life support and a family member wants to remove life support, but the other family member wants to keep it, that type of thing. You can feel that conflict. On the one hand, you have an obligation to the patient, and you have the obligation to do the greatest good, right? That's part of the principle of beneficence up there. But at the same time, in a hospital setting, there's limited resources, and in a situation where you're distributing those resources equitably, this is justice, you have to make some difficult decisions of what to prioritize there. So in terms of what they're looking for here, any time you're faced with a difficult decision in the MMI setting, you need to talk about the pros and the cons of all of the options in front of you. It's not enough to be asked a question, think of an answer, pick one option and run with it. I need to hear you reason through the pros and the cons of all the options that are available to you. It's the equivalent in, any of these math courses where you're required to show your work, and the majority of the credit you're getting is for showing your work. The MMI is the exact same. I need to understand how you arrived at your answer, even more important than I need to understand what your actual answer is, okay? So, as we're talking about a framework of how to do that, this is how I recommend you approach any ethical dilemma that you are faced with in the MMI setting. Number one, the first thing you're going to do, pretty much for any MMI type scenario, is kind of set the scene. A simple, broad overview. This is the situation as I understand it. This is the decision that I'm faced with. Tell me that you understand what's going on here, very briefly. Now, immediately following that, I always recommend applicants take a moment to acknowledge how difficult the situation that you're being placed in is, right? And that life support example we just talked about, this is a very complex, hard decision that you are faced with. And the applicant who's able to sit there and say, look, ultimately, I want to recognize this is a huge decision with a lot of gravity, and I recognize that. In the real world, you can even say, look, I know that I'd be able to draw upon a team of support members and other physicians and other team members to help me make this decision. However, in this setting, I'm asked to make that decision myself, and I'm prepared to do that. Next is you're going to be sure to discuss both sides of the coin. This is that discuss the pros and the cons. You might have that decision in your mind right away. You might know what you want to say. That's fine. But I want to hear you talk about the other option as well, and not just the negative parts of that other option. Because the odds are there are some pros and some positives of the option you're not choosing. I need to hear pros and cons of both options that are available to you before we come to a final decision. Okay. Now, this is the opportunity here, number 4, to really start separating yourself from others. And if I go back one slide, each of these are going to have a standout opportunity listed there. The standout opportunity with ethical dilemmas, is the ability to use and discuss these principles of medical ethics in your answer. Okay? So again, as you're talking about this situation with the life support, you're talking about beneficence and your obligation to the patient to do the greatest good. You're the physician. You owe that to the patient. That's your job. Great. At the same time, justice is the other kind of factor at play there. I want you to be able to use these terms, discuss them, include them in your answer. That is the 10 out of 10 level answer that very, very few applicants get to. When an applicant is able to use those terms effectively and explain how they're impacting their decision, that's what's going to separate you from other applicants. That's the 10 out of 10 answer in these types of settings. So the more comfortable you are with these 4 pillars, the more likely you are to be able to use them in the answer that you're giving. Okay? And then finally, with ethical dilemmas, you have to answer the question. I'm asking you a question. I'm expecting an answer. I'm interested to hear your answer. I will point out, nowhere in this template is there a right or wrong answer. Most of the time, any of these scenarios are completely up to you. I'm not going to judge you based on the answer that you pick. I'm going to judge you based on whether you have supported the eventual answer that you're giving. Okay? So, what I have now is an example of an actual scenario from a previous MMI setting. I'm going to give us a chance to read it, and then we'll see if I have a brave soul who wants to go through our steps on the previous slide. But first read it and see if you understand what's going on, and then we can go through. Okay, so here's our ethical dilemma. Now, does anyone want to take a stab at trying to give me an answer just following these 5 steps? We can go one by one, and I can help you through the steps as well. Why don't we first just set the scene? Someone just tell me, big picture, what's going on here? Yeah?
So you need to do liver transplants. You have 2 choices because you don't have one liver, but 2 patients who need it equally and will survive equally from that transplants. One is an elder who is very involved in the community, and the other is a young person who unfortunately is also addicted to methamphetamine. So I need to make a choice between those 2 people with their qualities.
Beautiful. That is a perfect start, okay? So right now, I understand that you know what's going on in this setting. You kind of understand the two options that are available to you. Now, the next step we're going to dive into, after a quick pause that says, look, this is a serious situation, I understand, big decision. I now want to go pros and cons of both decisions. So we'll start first. Someone give me the pros and cons of giving the liver to the 70-year-old. Yeah, here, let's go here.
Okay, so given that he's a person that has already given so much to the community, we can assume that he'll continue to do that in the future because that's who he's shown us that he is.
Totally.
So if we give the liver to him, he likely can have another 20 years of life in which he will contribute to the community, and that liver will afford him to do so.
Totally.
So if we don't give it to him, we're missing out on that. But on the other part, if like he's a 70-year-old, he has many less years to live.
Totally.
An average 20-year-old. So
Beautiful.
the liver will
It might not offer as much benefit because there's potentially less to gain by giving it to an older patient. I completely agree. That is perfect, okay? So that's the one option, is give it to the 70-year-old. We just went over pros and cons. Now, we have another option to give it to the younger patient. So pros and cons of the 20-year-old.
The 20-year-old is less likely to have like comorbidities, which would damage the liver, but she does have like drug and alcohol habits, which are behavioral. And I think what would make me like more willing to give it to a 20-year-old is if she was like willing or determined to like improve her condition, because she has more quality adjusted life years.
Yep.
And she would be able to have a liver for longer, and she would have the potential to like contribute to the community as well if she was like willing to change.
Totally, totally. So con here, there are some addiction issues, and we know historically patients with addiction issues, you know, maybe that liver transplant doesn't do as well in a patient with addiction issues. But in terms of the pros of making this decision, it's a very young patient with a lot of years left to live. So if that liver does succeed, this patient's gaining, you know, maybe 50, 60 extra years of life, which is incredible, okay? So just like that, we have not yet made a decision. We haven't put our foot down on anything. All we've done is discuss the pros and cons of the options available to us. Now, from there, we then say, look, considering those factors, what I'm thinking about in the back of my mind are the principles of ethics that are at play here. And first and foremost, that's again, beneficence. You have an obligation to both of these patients. Your job is to do the greatest good. You took an oath to do that. That's one of your responsibilities. Again, though, that's with justice. That's, you know, pitted against here, justice. You have a limited resource, and in the role of the physician, your job is to distribute that resource as fairly as possible. So that tension that you're feeling here, that little bit of discomfort in making this decision, is because these two things are directly conflicting with each other. If you can talk about that, if you can say that out loud, that's what's going to separate you from every other applicant who comes through that room, because nobody reaches that level in discussion. Then finally, the very last thing that we don't even need to review, say your answer and give me a reason. I don't care what the answer is, I really don't. I care that you did answer it and that you supported it. It's that simple. We don't even need to review that part because that's not the focus of the MMI, and I can't drive that point home enough. Don't stress about the answer because that's not what matters. Okay? That is the ethical dilemma. Let's pause here. Questions? Maybe? What's gonna?
Is it always the case that there's no like right or wrong answer? Because sometimes there may be like
Yeah.
regulation about in this case it should do this.
So this gets at an important point. The expectation, you should not have to come into that room with any outside knowledge whatsoever, right? So if I'm asking you a question that requires you to understand the nitty-gritty details of, you know, reporting laws in California versus another state, you know, I wouldn't waste your time preparing for that because you're not going to be faced with having to make a decision like that. You should not come in there or need to come in there with any outside knowledge to answer these questions. Now, what you said though is there are scenarios in which there is a clear right and a wrong answer, right? You're going to be, you know, having to, you know, talk to someone about something they're doing wrong or something like that. There's times when it's very obvious, but for the most part, the reason that these are designed is for it to be ambiguous. That's the point of the ethical dilemma. So if there's a clear answer, yes, of course, you're going to talk and give that answer. But for the most part, no right or wrong. No right or wrong. That's by design. Okay. Ethical dilemma. Good? Okay. Next. This one I call the difficult patient. This one is a situation in which somebody in front of you, whether it's a friend, loved one, family member, someone is making a decision that on the surface doesn't seem to make a ton of sense to you, okay? Someone was just diagnosed with some really serious condition, they declined treatment, and they said they're going to pursue alternative medicine, okay? That's a classic example. You have a friend who is joining a new club, and as part of the hazing for the new club, they have to go live in the wilderness for 5 days with no food or water, okay? Someone is making a decision that doesn't make any sense on the surface. But it's your job to kind of start getting to the bottom of what's going into this and unpack what's going on below the surface, because obviously there's more to this than that simple decision, and it's your job to figure that out. So how do we go about that? These 5 steps. Again, number 1, we're going to set the scene. Okay, simple overview. What's the example? What's the situation here? What do we need to do? Number 2, it is very important in these situations to focus on putting yourself in the shoes of this other person. Okay, in that cancer example, it can be put yourself in the shoes of that person who just received that diagnosis. It's incredibly overwhelming. There's so much going through your head. Maybe you don't fully understand. There's all these different factors at play. There's a lot on your mind in that moment. It's not as simple as, okay, yeah, let's go for it, right? You have to give them time and space to process all that information. And I want to hear you say, look, when I put myself in the shoes of this person, this would be a really challenging moment, and I'm not sure exactly how I would be feeling, but I know it would be very overwhelming, and there could be a lot of things going on in my mind. Okay? Because number 3, now you're going to start to identify what are specifically some of those factors that are leading a person to be making this decision. In the cancer situation again, maybe they're just overwhelmed. Maybe people, sometimes in moments of high emotions, they just kind of shut down. That happens. That's very natural for any of us, right? Maybe they don't fully understand the diagnosis. Maybe they need more information. Maybe they're worried about what treatment is going to cost. Maybe they're worried about being a burden on their family. Okay, I want to hear you reason through all of the different factors that could be influencing this person to make this decision. The reason that's so important is because at the end of the day, your job as a physician is to help this person navigate this decision, right? I'm saying from a clinical perspective, but they could just as easily ask you to help a friend navigate a challenging situation, right? If you're not able to hypothesize and put yourself in the shoes of this person, you're not going to be able to break down those barriers that are preventing the person from getting the care that they need or receiving the support from the friend that they need. So hearing you say, maybe they need more information, maybe they need time to process, maybe I need to make sure that we don't need to get their family members involved and talk about this as a team, that tells me that you would be able to simultaneously address every one of those things in that moment with that patient. That's what a doctor is doing every day, right? Think of the ED doctors that are down there delivering news like this and going through these situations. If you're not even able to think about what's going through this patient's mind in this moment, you're not able to help them. It's that simple, right? That's what these questions are testing, and that's why these are so common, because this is what a doctor does every single day, okay? Now, after you've gone through the list of different options of things that could be influencing this person, the next thing that you need to do is say, look, at the end of the day, no matter what decision you make, no matter what factors are at play here, I want you to know that we are in this together. I am here to help you with whatever decision you make, whatever problems you're facing, whatever's going on. I am your teammate, I am your advocate. However you want to move forward, I'm going to support you in that. And that connection and that, end-all be-all of this question is partnering with the patient after you've been able to put yourself in their shoes, okay? And then the final thing is, of course, I'm sure that we're all familiar with this, is we have to respect patient autonomy, right? These patients, friends, whatever, may be making decisions that are not in their best interest. But that's not for you to say, right? Your job is to educate a person provide them with all the information they need to make an informed decision. It is not your decision. It will never be your decision. That's not your job, okay? The importance of always sticking to that in these types of scenarios is critical, because there's never a moment in which you're taking that away from a patient. You always respect patient autonomy, okay? Very good. Let's put it into practice. These are real, by the way. Each of these is from my time at UC San Diego. We used these in the real thing. So read this first. Now, we'll go back to our checklist here. We're going to start first with, let's kind of combine the first two. Let's do the first two together. Set the scene and then give me some kind of acknowledgement of what's going on with this patient. Yeah.
So basically the scene is, okay, there's a patient and her like hemoglobin level clearly indicates that she's in a dangerous situation and she can't leave the hospital if she wants to survive, but she says like, oh, like I'm feeling fine, you know, I don't need all these treatment, I just want to get out of the hospital and live my own life. So that's the challenge, is that like the patient like insists on leaving. Well, we clearly know that that patient wouldn't survive once she leaves the hospital. And I guess where the patient's coming from is maybe she has like an urgent like family situation that requires her to like be out, or if there could be like other reasons, maybe like, you know, there's something that the patient doesn't like about the hospital. Maybe she feels she's not getting proper care, she's getting charged too much. It could be like financial situation. The longer she stays in the hospital, the more financial burden it's gonna put on her family. So there could be like multiple reasons that requires us to like ask like further follow-up questions to exactly identify why she wants to leave the hospital, while like despite us having told that, okay, your blood flow level's not okay.
Totally, right? And this list goes on, right? We can think of many, many different things. In this scenario, it's those other ones I mentioned too. It's maybe they don't fully understand the situation, maybe they need more information about what treatment looks like, et cetera, et cetera. But the more that you're able to list in that situation, the better, because that gives me more confidence that you'd be able to handle this situation in the real world. That is the most important fundamental point of the difficult patient type scenario. And that was an excellent job with that. Very, very good. Questions on these ones? I'm sure you've all seen, for those of you that have started MMI review, these types of questions where somebody is making a decision that doesn't quite make sense. It's your job to figure out why, ultimately, without a doubt. Okay, so next is the role play scenario, okay? In these scenarios, basically, these are somewhat acting scenarios, okay? You're going to be put in a position where you are going to have to go, you know, either confront someone or break some bad news, really have what is a challenging conversation with a friend, colleague, coworker, something like that. So whether you are going in there to share some bad news, whether you have to go confront someone who's doing something unethical or something that you don't agree with, okay? The most common thing is to kind of not take, to try to control the situation, I guess is what I would say. And I think the most important opportunity to try to stand out is when you recognize you're going into a heated situation like this, there's a lot of potential for things to escalate. There's a lot of potential for things to get out of hand, for things to get uncomfortable. If you're confronting someone, they might be very defensive. If you're breaking bad news, they might be very emotional. The applicant that's able to kind of preemptively get ahead of that, set a comfortable scene to have that conversation, be kind of upfront with them, always taking responsibility for what's going on, those are the applicants that are really, really successful. And for these, there's not so much a checklist because there's so much variety in the type of scenario that you might be faced with, as much as there is a series of important points that you want to make sure you bring with you into that room, okay? So number one is that supportive tone of, you know, I'm breaking some bad news with you, or I have to confront you about something in a non-judgmental way. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to talk about what's been going on, get to the bottom of why that might be happening in the situation of breaking bad news. In the confrontational one, In the breaking bad news, you want to kind of start gently and create that space of, hey, I have some difficult information to share. Why don't we sit down and talk about this together? Those are kind of the most important ways to set a supportive tone in those environments. Now, in both of these scenarios, it's incredibly important to be clear and get straight to the point. This is not a moment to kind of dance around the bush of, oh, you know, there's this bad news, but, oh, it's going to be okay. Very clear, to the point, here's the bad news. If you're confronting someone, very clear, to the point, here's why I wanted to talk to you today. Here's what I've seen that's been going on. Why don't we talk about why that's happening, okay? Right away. There's no time to, you know, kind of dance around things. You want to get to the point. Now, after you've either confronted someone or you've decided to break bad news, you've got to give some space here, okay? You've brought up this negative thing that you wanted to say to someone. You got to let them react. Sometimes it could be really emotional. Sometimes people need time. Sometimes it takes them a second to kind of get their emotions processed. Either way, you don't want them to feel like you're pressuring them and putting them in an uncomfortable situation. In the breaking bad news section, you can imagine if I've just given someone some really sad, devastating news, you're going to want to allow some time for them to process that information. Okay? And then, of course, this gets back to some common themes now we're establishing. That partnership, emphasizing your ability to understand what that person is going through, is critically important in any type of MMI setting. Very, very important. Now, this one's a little more tough. And if we have a volunteer, I will be Miss Jones as we talk about some tough news. Miss Jones is going to be nice today, I promise. Does anyone want to try this? Let's go. Okay, perfect. I just got back from my trip. I'm unpacking my things. It was a great time. We had an awesome time at the beach. We really enjoyed ourselves. I'm really happy to be back. I can't seem to find my dog anywhere.
Good to hear that you had a good time
Yeah.
on vacation. So, unfortunately, I have some bad news for you.
Okay.
When I was looking after your dog, I unfortunately found the dog dead. So,
How did this happen?
so I believe your dog was struck by a car,
Yeah.
and I want to just extend any support and be able to help you through this grieving process. If you need any support, I'm always here.
I thought that I left you in charge of watching him.
Yes. Unfortunately, I am also obligated with other tasks, and I was trying to do my best in order to keep Hank safe, but I failed, and that was my responsibility. That was my fault. So I'm incredibly sorry for this loss, and it was a poor reflection of me.
Pretty darn good. All right. I think we can be a little less blunt with the breaking up the news. But I did tell you to be straight to the point. At the end of the day, that was pretty much as straight to the point as it gets, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that very much. But you'll notice what we did there is we were straight to the point. We created a scene. You kind of shot me a warning that says, hey, I've got some news that I want to share with you, and I want us to kind of have a more serious discussion. I appreciated that warning that you gave me. The other thing I appreciated is in these scenarios, there's always this tendency to create excuses and not take responsibility for what happened. And immediately, I gave you a little pushback of, hey, you know, I thought you were in charge of the gate. What happened there, right? And you immediately took responsibility and said, look, you know, this was my fault. This was my mistake. I take responsibility for that, and I'm sorry, ultimately, okay? So those aspects of the answer were really, really good and excellent, okay? Obviously, in the real setting, you're going to have a professional actor who's going to be very dramatic, and you know they're really going to play into it. But the core principles of what you did there are fantastic, and bringing that same approach when you're breaking bad news anytime will really, really help you in these scenarios. Yeah. I'm still not going to let you watch my dog, though. Yeah. Yeah.
You just said what you just said about the actor. How realistic are they?
Very.
Are they going to start yelling or crying? Or?
Crying, yes. These are paid actors. Yeah, 100%. This is what they do. Correct, right? And you're going to sit there and you're going to wait. You're going to give space. You're going to give silence and let it happen and check in with them. Yeah. I'd say, hey, look, I'm glad you're back from the trip. There's something we need to discuss. Why don't you come with me and why don't we sit down and have a difficult conversation here? I know that while you were gone, you left me with the responsibility of taking care of your dog. And unfortunately, I want you to know that Hank did get out while I was watching him, and he was hit by a car. And unfortunately, Hank has passed. I know that it was my responsibility to take care of the dog while you were away. And ultimately, I have failed at that responsibility. This is something that I take very seriously. This is not something that I take lightly. I know how much Hank means to you. I want you to know Hank meant a lot to me as well. I want to apologize for having this happen. And ultimately, I want to be here for you as we kind of navigate this emotional time together going forward. Something like that, to that effect, is how I would do it. Yeah. But that's the same, my point with these is, as it is with the others, is you don't need to prepare specifically for breaking someone's news that someone's dog died, right? What you need is a framework to fall back upon when you're faced with any type of scenario like this. If you're prepared with the framework, you'll be prepared for any scenario that you're faced with. Those are the applicants that are successful ultimately, for sure. Any questions there? Yeah. Totally. Well, it's like in this scenario, you have to keep your composure, right? And ultimately, your job is to be professional in that setting. Would I shy away from showing some emotion? No, absolutely not. This person might be hysterically crying in front of you. You're going to want to comfort them. You're going to want to say, look, I can really see how much this hurts you, and I want you to know this hurts me as well. I'm very sorry that this has happened, and I take this very seriously. So I wouldn't shy away from that. That being said, I don't know if there's nothing on the grading rubric that says, did the applicant start crying? That's not necessary, right? But showing some emotion and being with them in that moment is incredibly important. Incredibly important, for sure. Of course. Yeah.
Are you given any time to just prepare your response?
Yes, great question. So the general format of these will be somewhere 6 to 8 stations. You have about 8 minutes inside the room, but they will give you the prompt and you'll have 2 minutes to prepare before you go into the room. If it's a Zoom setting, they'll send you the prompt beforehand. Before your camera is on or whatever they do, you do have 2 minutes to collect yourself and kind of develop an approach to your answer. And that's the exact moment where having that framework in mind, here's how I want to do this, boom, 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 is really important because 2 minutes goes by like that. So suddenly you're on camera and it's showtime. And if you have a rough idea of how to do this, it can save you a lot of time. Yeah. Yeah.
How much leeway do you have in this scenario? So let's say your neighbor is really angry and she demands
Yeah.
compensation or lawsuit. And what are you supposed to do?
You de-escalate, de-escalate, de-escalate. You say, look, I can tell you're very upset. I'm sorry that this happened. And you do everything that you can to remain very calm while they are emotional, right? You do not match their emotion. You obviously don't raise your voice. You don't yell back. You don't do these things, right? You're going to be judged in that situation of, are you able to kind of keep your cool, de-escalate as much as possible, okay? Now, this is a scenario that is made up, right? But every day, there are challenging patients, okay? There's patients that don't like your diagnosis. There's patients that don't like, the opinion that you're giving. These situations are very real. So again, everything that we're doing in an MMI setting translates directly to a job or a task that you will be faced with as a doctor on a daily, if not daily, weekly basis, okay? So that's why we're judging these scenarios, because this tells us how you're going to handle that really challenging patient that you work with in the clinic when you're a doctor, without a doubt. Any other questions here? Yeah. Yeah, totally. And this is a balance, right? You don't want to be, Patronizing, I think, is the perfect word, honestly. You really don't want that. You also don't want to be too casual in any of these settings, right? It's all about being professional. You are treating this as, your job that you're going in there and doing. And that means don't patronize the patient. Support them without being, over the top about it, and always be professional. We don't like the casual nature that this kind of lends itself to sometimes. We really need to avoid that as well. It's an excellent point. Very, very good point. Okay, good here? Okay, now, those are the most common buckets of MMI specific type questions. Now, I made a point earlier about how you must also be prepared for traditional interviews anytime you're in an MMI setting. At San Diego, one of the stations we always dedicated to the why do you want to be a doctor question. Okay? Critically important, as you can imagine, right? Perhaps the most important interview question that you can be asked. So one of the 8 stations there, no matter what we did to the other ones, we changed them up, down, left, right, new different scenarios, the one that always stayed was the why do you want to be a doctor question. So my point with that is that you need to go in there prepared for all of the most common types of questions. The why medicine, what's your biggest weakness, why our university versus others, all of those types of classic interview questions you need to be prepared for. And we don't have time to run through all of them, but just generally speaking, my point is that you have to be prepared for traditional as well, without a doubt. Yeah.
Some of these questions, or many of them, seem to be extremely similar to the secondary exam prompts.
Yes.
Like, what's your weakness, or like, why are school, or like the why do you want to be a doctor? That's like your personal statement. So how do you do it so that you're not just
100%. I love this. Love this, right? Because I do these interview preps all the time, right? So in this past cycle, I've probably done 50 or 60 of these interview preparation sessions with the applicants that I've written their primary application with them and their secondaries with them. So I love that point because we get to interview session and I ask them in our mock interview, what's your greatest weakness? And they blow it. A total terrible answer, and they're just not prepared. And I say, hey, you've already written an answer to this. We've already done this together. You just need to go back to your secondaries and think about the work you've already put in, right? At that point in time, me working with that applicant, we've already put 10 hours into secondaries together. They have the answer. It's right there. The same exact approach that you brought to those secondary questions, you can bring to these answers as well. You wrote a strong secondary. You've already answered this question effectively. Give me that answer. In the MMI setting, they are unlikely to have read and reviewed your application at this point. So recycling that answer is not a problem at all. Honestly, generally, even in traditional interviews, recycling the framework of an answer that you gave in secondaries is completely fine. Completely fine. Yeah.
How long are the interviews supposed to be?
So the MMI interview day will be about 8 sessions. Each of them will be, let's call it 10 minutes per session. So that's 80 minutes. So your MMI experience will last a little bit over an hour and a half, around an hour and a half. While you're just cycling through station, station, station. You walk out of one, you're immediately going to the next room. Boom, boom, boom. It doesn't feel like a ton of time, or maybe it does, I don't know. But in the moment, it's a lot. And you've got to be on your game because you're moving through one by one. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions here? Yeah.
Just to make sure I understand correctly, so like in order to not like make this interview a repetition of a secondary application, we need to bring like this.
I wouldn't worry about that, honestly. I think that interviewer sitting in front of you is sometimes going to interview 50 people. The odds of them, even if it's an open file interview where they have access to your entire application, the odds of them in any way penalizing you for repeating information is incredibly low. In fact, I'm looking for you to have developed similar themes throughout your application, right? You gave me that answer in the first place because it was a strong answer. Me asking you the same question and expecting you to give me another strong answer is silly. I would never do that. It doesn't make sense. You've already given me a strong answer, give me that strong answer again. Yeah. If I remembered your answer the first time, I probably wouldn't ask the question. Other questions? Yeah.
What do you think about the idea that if you're offered an interview from a school that
Okay, so I can do the second one for sure. Help me with that first one. What do you mean yours to lose?
Some people have said that if you're offered an interview, unless you basically give them like a red flag answer or like don't do well and come off as very like unpersonable, then you have a very good chance of like getting into it.
Yeah, now that part is true. Once you're at the interview portion, the odds of getting in is sometimes as high as 50% at some schools. It totally varies school to school. Some will interview more, some will interview less. UCSF, for example, is the one that comes off the top of my head. It's over 50% that they accept of people that are interviewing. So based on that, I understand where we're coming from. But at the end of the day, of course, we're not going to give any red flags. We're not going to say anything disqualifying, which you'd be shocked. You'd be absolutely shocked what people say. But we're going to avoid all of that, certainly. But we also want to stand out, right? I'm not going to leave that up to chance. I'm not going to show up and put in, okay work and then rely on I've got a 50-50 chance of making it work. You're always going to want to separate yourself. So no matter what, even if the odds are high, you got to come in prepared, for sure. But to your point, once you're at the interview process, you've been offered an interview, you are way more likely to get in now than you were before. Yeah. Good question. Other questions? Okay, final thing is quick roadblocks that come up through over the course of the interview day. It's unfortunate and it's a bummer, but it totally happens, and no one's really ever expecting this to happen to them, right? But it does. So what I never want you to be afraid of doing is when your mind goes blank, when you panic, when you freak out, you forget where you're going with something, it is always acceptable to say, hey, can you give me a moment to collect my thoughts and kind of think about this a bit longer? That is way better than sitting there awkwardly for 60 seconds, like staring at me, and I'm watching the gears turn in your head and the lights are out and no one's home. Like, it's a little tough, right? Give me a heads up that you're going to take some time. Like, that's totally reasonable to say, hey, I just need a moment. I'm going to say, great, take your time. Whenever you're ready, give me your answer. That's not an issue at all. But have that in the back of your mind if you need it, so that there's no panic, there's no shutdown, there's no going blank, because that happens, unfortunately, and the stakes are too high for that to hurt any of you. Okay? Very good. And then, of course, I've preached on to stay professional. You can't control who's interviewing you, particularly in a traditional setting. There's all kinds of different personalities. Some people are engaging, some people aren't, some people are interested, some people aren't. All of that is out of your control. The only thing you're going to be able to control is what you're telling me at the end of the day, right? So you got to keep your cool. You got to stay collected, even if you're not really vibing with your interviewer. At the end of the day, that's your draw. You got to live with it, and you got to make the most of it, for sure. Then brief note here as we close, thank you notes. I can say confidently, applicants stress about this so much. I have never seen a thank you note make or break someone's opportunity of getting into medical school, ever, okay? People interview and then they freak out immediately about thank you notes. If you must, send a thank you note to the admissions committee as a whole. I appreciate you having me. I had an awesome time at your interview day. I look forward to hearing back from you. Leave it at that, right? If you've got the itch, scratch it, okay? Fine. But this is not going to be the reason you get into medical school. This is a huge source of stress and anxiety. It shouldn't be. Do it if you feel like you have to. Short, sweet, simple, okay? That's what I have. Again, this is what we do at MedSchoolCoach is we go through these, we do the interview prep, we walk people through all of these strategies and many, many more. For all of those strategies we just did on those specific MMI type scenarios, we could do that exact same thing for 2 more hours on traditional interviews, and I could break down any of those questions step by step of how to approach them effectively, okay? So if anyone is interested at any point in time, it's really what we do, it's what I do, and I'm happy to help any of you, okay? Pleasure, everyone.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. That concludes our conference for today. If you guys have any questions, feel free to come up and ask anyone here.